Well, thank you so much for that really interesting discussion. It's interesting to see the progress on crew change, also the challenges that still remain. Well, thank you for this first part of the panel, and we're now going to turn to a second part of this panel, which has to do with one of the particular topics that really is vital in the whole crew change crisis and getting back to normal, and that is seafarers vaccination. I am delighted to be joined by a number of really people who have detailed knowledge of what's happening or what's not happening around the world as far as vaccinations are concerned. First, my name is Jason Zaidema. I work with ICMA, the International Christian Maritime Association. Very, very happy to be partnering with Crew Connect Europe to bring this conference to you in the next few days. And for this panel, I'm joined by Francesco Gargiulo, who is with IMEC, Simon Frank, who is with the Tome Group, Sohail Bhatti, who is with the Director of Public Health for Gibraltar, and also Ashish Puri, who is a senior management and maritime executive with lots of experience in the maritime industry. Francesco, I'll start with you. If you could give us an update on where you see things in terms of vaccinations. Why is this so important, and what priorities does IMEC have? What actions is IMEC taking in seafarer vaccination?
Thanks, Jason. Yes, first and foremost, hello everyone, and thank you for having us. The vaccination issue is obviously something that dovetails with the previous session, because ultimately the reason why we're also worried about vaccinating seafarers is because we want to avoid another crew change crisis. And I think that was what was the overwhelming factor of the last 12 months. We've had some severe issues in terms of trying to repatriate seafarers, trying to make sure that the shipping industry, which actually fuels 80 to 90% of world trade, continues to operate smoothly. Because let's face it, whilst everything stopped during the pandemic, the one thing that didn't stop was ships. Ships and ports continue to operate, supermarket shelves continue to be stacked, your medical facilities continue to come in, and so on and so forth. Everything continued to work. And the only reason that happened is because seafarers continued to do their job. And in many cases, they sacrificed their own private needs, because we had, as the previous panel was telling us, up to 400,000 seafarers who were significantly overdue in terms of their contract expiration. So people were stuck on board for sometimes up to a year and more in some cases, some extreme cases. Vaccination for us is a way to prevent this from happening all over again. We had a situation where perhaps towards May last year, things were really dire. Then things calming down in the summer, some crew changes were able to take place. We then had another surge, and then crew changes were put on hold once again. What we want is for that light at the end of the tunnel to be out there. We want to make sure that seafarers are vaccinated, and with their vaccination, to be able to actually have exemptions from a lot of the travel restrictions that are making things really, really difficult for the industry. Now, IMEC is, as probably many of you guys know, is not necessarily into the business of either crew changes or vaccination. What we do is collective bargaining. But of course, we pitched in because we realized that our members needed help in this particular area. And one of the things that we bring to the forum, to the task force that the industry has put together, is access to crew managers, access to ship managers, access to ship owners, because we represent such a large chunk of the industry. And that access gave us also the ability to engage with our social partners and with the ITF in particular. And I think a lot of what we did, a lot of our successes came from working together with the social partners. And I think that's where IMEC sort of took off its negotiating hat to put on its bridge sort of between the Social Partners Act. some of our successes were mostly to do with facilitating crew changes and with initiating the concept of quarantine facilities, particularly with the one in the Philippines that has been so successful. But when it came to around December time, we realized we needed to get involved with vaccinations as well, because vaccination was the only way we were ever going to fix this once and for all. So we got involved in the ICS-led vaccination task force. We actually ourselves got involved into one of those tripartite initiatives in the Philippines, and together with the ITF, basically put in a request to purchase vaccines on behalf of seafarers. Clearly, a lot of the work going on in this area is focused on getting seafarers vaccinated at home. So as them being seen as priority workers, the way many countries have done during the crew crisis. What we wanted now is for them to be treated as a priority when it comes to inoculation. Some countries have done it right away without much lobbying, perhaps because they had ready availability of vaccines. Some other countries have taken a lot of lobbying and a lot of pressure and a lot of pushing. Some countries are still not keen on doing it. Our key concern in this area, and then I'll let others speak because I don't want to take too much of the time. Our key concern is that most seafarers tend to come from countries where vaccines are not readily available. And that's our concern. Because of this concern, we've obviously started working with the task force. We started working on the concept of hubs around the world and the concept of perhaps acquiring vaccines that are specifically aimed at seafarers that can be administered in these hubs. Because, of course, if you look at Filipinos and Indians and Indonesians and Chinese seafarers, perhaps Chinese being the one exception, they're all struggling to get their vaccines in their home country. And this is the sort of situation that we find ourselves in. We want to make sure that there are options. Massive kudos to the US and, in fact, to NAMA and ICMA for sharing those opportunities. There's a lot of chances now for seafarers to get vaccinated in America because a large number, 50, 60 US ports are actually making those available. But of course, the US has a surplus of vaccines, which is a very different situation from the likes of the Philippines and the likes of India. So there are a lot of initiatives out there, and thanks to NAMA and ICMA for trying to tie them all up together so that people have a one-stop shop website that gives you a picture of that landscape. But there's also a lot of work to be done in terms of prioritizing seafarers, because even those countries that have elected seafarers as key workers are not necessarily following through with making them priority when it comes to vaccination. That's the sort of thing that we're trying to lobby for.
Thank you so much, Francesco. One thing that came out of your comments, the putting on another hat, I think most of us have found that we have all sorts of hats that we didn't know we had throughout this pandemic. So thank you so much. And thanks for the noting the websites, indeed, at icma.as and nama.org. You can click on vaccines and see the list of where vaccines are actually being offered. Next, let's turn to Simon Frank. Simon, tell us a bit about how you have, how your company is looking at vaccines and what initiatives that you would like to bring our attention to.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Jason, and thank you everybody to host or for this session here. We are now participating in. I think I'm talking about hats. I'll just start by putting on an operational hat and try to illustrate a bit on the operational side of how we see things right now. Not only about the vaccine, but also a little bit about the prehistory. We are a semi-sized ship management company, and we have been going through the motions that everybody else has been going through since all this started in March last year. But just to give some examples of numbers, when we saw the biggest dip in ability to make crew changes, and that was around June, July last year, we had around of a pool of 4,500 seafarers on board our ships. We had more than 10% on board for more than 11 months, and we had we had almost 25% of our seafarers more than 1 month above their contract. So basically in a position where they had to sign an extension. So that has created this huge operational task that crewing operations is still today. It's much better now, and the game changer that really happened summer last year was that, at least from an operational perspective, there were agreements on establishing quarantine and testing regimes that started to have a positive impact. It didn't have a positive impact on our seafarers, because that was really stretching them even more in terms of preparing for crew change. They had to come in for 2 or 1 or sometimes even 3 weeks before joining, and sitting in a quarantine facility that was not always very, very pleasant. But that became the mean to kind of manage the crisis and the situation. And now, obviously, we are in a situation where vaccine is where everybody is looking at in terms of seeing a solution. And again, from our experience and what we have seen so far is that we, exactly as Francesco was just mentioning, it's a very broken picture where we take our seafarers, or we recruit our seafarers from. There's almost a different situation in every single country, and we have been forced to take different approaches in different locations to be supportive in getting our seafarers vaccinated or vaccinated. For instance, Manila and Philippines, where we have our biggest pool, we have taken a lot of initiative from our side in investing in initiatives around purchasing and distributing vaccines. Whilst in other locations, it's supported by local governments, and we are more observing the development because we are not always capable of actually doing something to support this. But the positive element, of course, is that it's progressing. It's progressing in all regions, different speeds. And I also want to just bring kudos to what is happening in the US now. Great help for us. We have almost 400 seafarers now vaccinated with a single shot vaccine, and this is really an opportunity that came a little bit out of the blue, but that we by following up on has been able to actually see very successful in getting our seafarers vaccinated before we could expect. So from a strategic perspective right now, we have made investments where we can. We have in India arranged vaccine rallies in our office, invited seafarers in to come and get the vaccine there. One of the practical challenges is the frequency between the vaccines. It's been extended very much, so now it's up to 8 weeks, maybe even more. And that's a challenge when a seafarer sometimes is in a period where he's between 2 contracts. But all these things are working towards, of course, a much better situation. And the expectation we have is that once we have our seafarers vaccinated, they will have to be able to bypass all quarantine facilities and have a much more smooth process in getting on board, and thereby, in that respect, hopefully reach back to some kind of normal in terms of a normal crewing operation around a normal crew change. But we are definitely not there yet. We still see that there are locations where things are more easy than others, and some locations are still extremely strict regards to requirements coming in for seafarers to their location, and that's despite even the seafarers now being vaccinated. So that's a quick summing up on where we are. We hope very much and expect that we have seen the worst. The peak period for us was around July last year, and then a little bit of a peak again around Christmas. But right now, if you look at the numbers, it's acceptable. But you just have to consider that a crew change for a seafarer today is much more exhausting and demanding from his perspective and his side compared to normal. And that's not always seen in the figures when looking at statistics. So thanks, Jason.
Thank you, Simon, for those comments. what was heard in the last panel and what was heard again here is just the vast variety of experiences depending on the country, where seafarers just from one country to another can experience such a difference. It's perhaps it's too early to tell what exactly vaccination is going to do, but it would already seem to be bearing at least some fruit. Well, we have someone representing at least one government health agency. So, from your perspective in Gibraltar, what is the progress of vaccination, and why do you view it as important from your perspective?
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm reporting from the first post-COVID society in the world. We have 85% of everyone over the age of 40 that I've been able to identify vaccinated, and our overarching one is 75%. In fact, we've vaccinated more than our entire population. We're at 125%, and people are normal. The only time we ask people to wear masks is to visit shops, because I've got very little control over the borders. As a port, of course, Gibraltar has always been a place where crew changes could take place, and throughout the pandemic, we kept the port open. I developed the protocols to allow us to safely enable people to come off. I mean, I reiterate, people were on ships for a year, 2 years, some of them nearly, and we let them off. Vaccination, this is my fourth pandemic, by the way. All of the people alive here that I can see, this is your fourth pandemic. This is not the only pandemic. We had a pandemic in '68. We have an HIV pandemic, which is still killing 30 million people. We had another one in 2008, and this is the latest version. Vaccines buy us a degree of capability and capacity to go back to normal. They do not wipe this disease out. And I expect actually for us to have annual vaccinations as time moves on, because the virus changes. That the Delta variant, for example, and I think a variant of that variant, which is a Nepalese one, can all bring more serious harm. But what vaccination, even one dose of a vaccine does, is it provides a degree of protection. It changes the disease for something that's a killer to something that's an inconvenience for the vast majority of people. And for particularly around the importance of crews, because our society depends on them. It's been really, really difficult, as everyone has reiterated, to navigate through the different iterations, whether you're allowed to travel, whether the airlines are open, whether the ships are allowing. There's a desperation amongst the sea for people to get on and off ships. And we've tried in Gibraltar to help as much as possible. We've been hamstrung because we can't get hold of the vaccine. Our entire supply, for example, is coming from the UK government. Now, what I expect to happen over time, and I think it's coming out in the US at the moment and now in Northern Europe, is there will be a surfeit of supplies. And that then means the important thing for crew vaccination is accurate record keeping. One of the things that we want to ensure, because not all vaccines are entirely without side effects, and that's going to be an important point when it comes to boosters. If you've had rigors, I got rigors when I got my vaccination, shaking, in other words, and feeling really, really cold. That's not a serious effect, but it might have an impact on my thought pattern if I wanted a booster. Can I have that one, please? Can I have the other one, please? Or actually, I'll give it a buy for the moment. Now, that's really, really important in terms of keeping the crew at sea, is what their attitudes are. And what we know from human behavior is a shortage actually encourages people to take up the vaccine. That's precisely what happened in Gibraltar. We had a limited supply, and we were inundated by people trying to take on the vaccine and try to get hold of it as much as possible. So I think a port such as Gibraltar, with we do about 20. We did in a normal year about 20,000. We've got the facilities to vaccinate. We've got 100,000 ships going through the Straits of Gibraltar, and we could actually be quite a reasonable stopping point for people to get vaccinated. The 1 and 2 dose argument, the Janssen one, they say it's only 1 dose. Well, actually, so is the AstraZeneca, if you want to look at it. They're roughly comparable. It's just that one's been marketed a bit more cleverly saying 1 dose will be enough. It doesn't give you the same degree of protection as 2 doses. And I think we've got to be really clear about that too, that actually having multiple doses, at least 2, is going to be your safest way to ensure your protection. In other words, you're able to carry on working even if you've got the virus. We've been lucky throughout the whole pandemic that we didn't have long queues of ships that were effectively plague ships, for want of a better word. So we managed a lot of that, but that was my nightmare, that we would have lots of ships docked up. And our protocols have kept us safe. It's kept my population safe. And of course, have the perspective of a government. The first job of a government is to ensure its electorate, its population is protected. So surprisingly, or not surprisingly, there's second tier, third tier responsibilities are keeping trade going. I mean, of course, civilization would collapse if the shops weren't full, but it's their first priority is to protect the population. And the key issue is how quickly can you vaccinate your population so you can move on to people who you don't regard as important. And countries, again, certain countries have been quicker off the mark. We were done, I think, according looking at my data, we had just effectively reached 100% vaccination because of our small size in about March. So we could then start to look at other populations. Be ready for more vaccination problems around boosters as we go forward. But I see in future the vaccination supply issue become much easier, certainly for the West, where there was an over-ordering of vaccines. And that may mean that we need some form of accreditation system to allow people to travel. Certainly in Gibraltar now, if you're double vaccinated, there isn't any quarantine requirements, even from the red countries. We are a little bit cautious a little bit at the moment, where we might put you on the ship rather than have you mix around our population, because we're still getting some breakthrough of disease, but it's not serious. No one's ended up in hospital. So even with double vaccination, you're still looking at about 10% of your population not being protected. But though that 10% of that population, almost all of them won't go into hospital. And if that was the main reason for lockdown, which was the destabilization of healthcare systems, then that's finished. We've basically converted with double vaccination a disease that can kill to a disease that's more like severe flu. And I think most of us can manage that. I'm not saying flu isn't a bad disease, and I'm not. The only other thing to be aware of is long COVID, where we're still accumulating evidence that getting the virus itself, I don't know how many people here on the panel have had the virus. I was one of the first people in my area to get the virus, and it was a very mild illness. Now with the Delta variant, it seems to be much more infectious, potentially can create more harm, but it's the long COVID that we also need to be aware of. So uptake of vaccination, if we can galvanize the West, which has got surfeit of supplies, to make it available for seafarers, I think actually that will be better than them passing the vaccine supplies to the poorer countries, because what poorer countries will do will immediately start to vaccinate their own population that they owe loyalty to. So paradoxically, it may be better if it's administered from the countries that got a surfeit supply, because they feel less of the political pressure of missing their own population out. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for those comments. Last but not least, Ashish Puri, from your perspective, why is vaccination important, and where do you see progress happening?
Hi, Jason, thank you. And thank you for all the panelists. I think most of the points that I wanted to mention are already covered. We have quite an expert group of panelists here. My name is Ashish Puri, and I have been in the maritime industry for 18 years. I'm in the final stages of transitioning to my new position. And thank you for inviting me. I think a lot has been spoken about the importance of vaccine, and that is absolutely clear. I mean, there's no discussion on that. I would like to bring this perspective that there has been a lot of efforts, but I still think we are missing the final collaboration between the different companies and the flag states together to reach the final goal. If you look at the vaccination drives, they have been going excellently in many of the countries, but at the same time, they have been not going so well in some countries. The question is, how do we bridge this gap? This COVID pandemic, and I think is here to stay. Of course, we are getting into a better mode now than we were 1 year back, but with the new variants and the new mutations, we do not know how it's going to progress. My point is, I think it's best when we collaborate. I've had many hats in the last 18 months and different hats, being from head of talent and development at Maersk, head of South Pacific Marine Services, who have been actively working on crew changes for Kiribati crews. I have been in various meetings with flag states, but I still see this disparity. And I think we really need to manage this and bridge the gap. On how we move from here onwards will determine exactly how do we remove this for our seafarers and make sailing safe for them across the world, because there is no doubt that the whole community or the seafaring industry is keeping the supply chains on. If you just look around yourself in your office or in your house, I can promise you 90% of the equipment or the things that you see would have been on a vessel at some stage. And it is extremely important that we make sure that our seafarers are treated as key workers and are put on priority list on vaccination on every single country. Having said that, as also echoing some of the points, many companies have excellent drives for vaccinating their crew. Despite that, there is a lot of challenges. Even though the companies want to get the seafarers vaccinated, we see a lot of the countries not being supportive enough. And I think that would be seen by all on the panel, where we face the challenge that the companies or the ship owners, they are really trying their level best to make sure that the crew is vaccinated, but we do not get enough support from the local legislations. And I think now is the time to find that bridge between the two so that we can win this battle together. That's all from my side, Jason.
Thank you so much, Ashish, for those comments and for, I think, wrapping together certain of the ideas that were presented by the others as well. If I could go back first to Sohail in Gibraltar, one question that perhaps is from our other panelists as well is, if the lever for a lot of these vaccinations is countries need to have that vaccine supply, how do we push on those levers a little bit harder? And in your particular case, for example, in Gibraltar, who do we push on? How do we push to perhaps get vaccine supply to Gibraltar that can be used for the vaccination of seafarers if you have indeed so many ships sailing right by?
So, I mean, the main issue for us was not a desire not to vaccinate. We actually have the infrastructure. We could do it if we wanted to. But the priority, as I said, for the first 3 months was our own population. Now that we've finished that, we're ready, willing and able. So I think COVAX might be the route to it. I think there's even an argument for looking at international maritime trade as being almost a separate nation under the UN, because there's the whole of civilization sort of depends on what happens. And we can't, I think one of the lessons of the pandemic has been look after your supply chains, for God's sake, you know, forget about toilet paper and everything else. We need food to live on. And so there's a special provision that needs to be made, maybe under the COVAX initiative, where there's a chunk of vaccines that are moved over, and then it will be for the international maritime organizations to design where it should be best divested. You obviously need an infrastructure in terms of storage. There's a life cycle for these things. There's no point injecting people with things that have no longer efficacious. So, you know, the cold chain can be quite important. And again, you'd need to develop some of the expertise if you wanted to do that. Specifically in Gibraltar sense, I think I'm beginning to be approached by people in America who say we can get the vaccines to you. But one of the things we learned, for example, we had the Pfizer-BioNTech one, was it was very fragile and it could only be moved 3 times. So all these things we've been developing our expertise in, and storing at -70 was no mean feat. So I think there are a lot more different vaccines that are coming on board. The RNA ones are the best ones, the Modernas and the CureVac and some of the others, but I think all of them are efficacious. It is just a question of the supply chain. And that's where I don't think the maritime industry has necessarily got that expertise. Medicines has its own sort of wholesale system, and it is about linking that wholesale system to the maritime industry, and then perhaps the maritime industry itself, international maritime industry, deciding that if we were to have, and we need to think about boosters. I mean, I know I'm jumping ahead, we haven't got the vaccination done, but actually we need to think about how would we administer more vaccinations? Is it preferred sites? Is it any site? How would we maintain quality if it was every site, for example? You could be paying lots of money to get jabbed, but it would just be water, in effect, if it wasn't efficacious. So I think there's a lot to be done for the international maritime organizations, building knowledge about the wholesale around pharmaceuticals and vaccine administration, vaccine distribution, and then something about working perhaps with 1 or 2 preferred manufacturers around access. I don't know exactly how many millions of people work in the international maritime trade. Certainly is going to be millions of people. I think there is an argument to be made. Certainly a lot of people are at the poorer end, but for poorer countries, there's an argument to be made around reducing inequalities and having that conversation with maybe 4 or 5 manufacturers to say, how can we help to distribute our vaccines to, and as say, it could be particular sites, or it could be particular quality assured systems. I think my main worry is quality assurance, because I've been in this long enough to know that you can get injected by just plain water and not know it. And you may believe that you're well. Just another flag, a lot of people's behavior changes as soon as they've been jabbed in the arm. And that's actually the time when you're most likely to get the virus, because you don't get instant protection. It takes 2 to 3 weeks for your immune system to kick in. So the vast majority of our people that have gone on to develop some adverse outcomes, such as death even, they've been vaccinated, they've gone out and they've partied. They said, hey, I'm free now, I'm protected. And it's the 3 weeks afterwards that you really need to allow the immune system to kick in. Just a reminder.
Thank you for that comment. It actually joins up one of the comments that came from our audience. Thank you, audience, for listening. The question from one of the audience members, and this can be also, I think, for any of the other panelists. Are there some agencies actually monitoring the side effects of vaccinations for seafarers on what's happening, on whether what the effects are after the seafarers get vaccinated? Who is following up on those things? Anyone collecting any data? Anyone? Francesco, Ashish, Simon? Simon, go ahead.
Yeah, that's a good question, because that was, of course, one of the unknown in terms of, especially, of course, vaccinating seafarers while on board. And one of the mitigation methods, and one of the things we have added into our protocol around how to do these sessions has been to not do the whole crew at one time. And I know that's a very operational approach. It's not a very medical supported approach, but it's just to be on at least on some adding some kind of safety and security into the process. So if there is unusual reactions, and the other thing we have also implemented is that we have access to medical advice and medical support in the situations where we are doing this. And that includes also leaving the vessel in the port for a number of hours after the vaccination rally has been taking place. So I think that in general, that has been one of the issues that we have struggled with very much, of course, adding the information and the expertise on on how should we approach this when we were guiding and supporting our seafarers in terms of vaccination or not vaccination. And I think we've been, like everyone else in the not only in our own industry, of course, we've been supporting the vaccine process based on the information that we had as a company with the guidance we got. But by the end of the day, of course, the risk we are aware is there, and we need to manage as we best can.
Francesco or Ashish, any follow-up comments on that? Are there any agencies actually monitoring side effects, or what are the other protocols that are perhaps in place after seafarers are getting vaccinated? Yes, go ahead, Francesco.
I'm not aware of anyone who's actually monitoring seafarers per se. There's a lot of monitoring taking place, particularly in what you would call first world countries. And there's a lot of close observation of the symptoms and the side effects, because obviously that's where the infrastructures are and where the knowledge is. One of the things I wanted to mention, perhaps, and that's going away from this conversation, but going back to what Sohail was saying, and he was saying about the challenge being the building a knowledge in the industry and so on and so forth. I mean, there was quite a lot of work put in by the task force to put together a protocol, a set of protocols that would inform ports and governments and individual companies when it comes to setting up their own vaccination hub. I sort of disagree with Sohail that that's the biggest problem, because I think the biggest problem remains convincing a government to talk to big pharma and convince them to sell us the vaccines, because that's been the biggest obstacle for us. So before we get to setting up the centers, setting up the vaccination centers and using those protocols, we need to actually have the raw material, and that's what's missing right now. COVAX was exactly the direction the task force went towards. We approached WHO approached COVAX. I believe, and this is perhaps something that Natalie from the previous panel would be much better equipped to discuss, but I believe there was a presentation to the COVAX board about the case for mariners, the case for treating them like a separate nationality almost, as you were saying before, because we want to be able to protect our own logistic chain. And I understand, and I may be slightly wrong here, but I understand that the response from COVAX was they would only ever prioritize health workers. So there was a no in terms of the straight answer, and a suggestion that perhaps we partnered with governments. And there's been a lot of talk between the industry and governments to see whether we can procure those vaccines, which remains the biggest obstacle, because where there is vaccinations are being provided. And, America is the greatest example, but the Dutch, the Belgians are doing it. The Russians have been doing it all along. The Chinese have been doing it all along. Now the Philippines has started to try and come online, but although there again is the actual stocks are the issue again. India, there are processes there, but there isn't enough vaccine. So I think that's the key issue, more than the processes. Once we've got the vaccines, there's more than enough experts, not necessarily in the marine industry, but in the infrastructure that's set up ashore to actually inoculate people properly. What we lack currently is access to those vaccines. And I think that's a very important point here.
Thank you, Francesco. Maybe just as we have only a few minutes left in this panel, this week we're celebrating the Day of the Seafarer. It's a fair future for seafarers. And I'm wondering if all four of you, if you have a short statement, why is vaccination and the process of vaccination so important for the fair future for seafarers? Why does this represent a question about the future? I wonder if I could start, if we can go in reverse order, I can start with Ashish and then Sohail, Simon, and Francesco.
Thank you, Jason. An excellent question. I think being a seafarer myself, I would like to highlight the reason why vaccination is so important is I would also like to quote the General Secretary, Mr. Carl Tecklin. It is important that no seafarer is negatively getting affected because of lack of vaccination. I think that is something that we as an industry should look into, that there is no negative impact to a seafarer because he or she cannot get vaccinated. And I think that would be the biggest win for this year on the Day of Seafarers. If we can manage that for every seafarer across the world, I think that would be the biggest win for me.
So, Hyle, from your perspective, why is this important for a fair future for seafarers?
So, I mean, what I went into as a medical professional, why I do this, I can summarize in 3 words: equality, fairness, and justice. I think it's what drives me. It doesn't matter if you're a landlubber and homeless. The issue is that you need to be treated like a human being, and you need to be treated equally and on the basis of need. Now, you know, crews are generally they're of a particular age range, but it's a very tough life out there. So justice demands it. If we want to have cheap food and commodities, the fairness of it is that we have to look after the people that provide us with those goods. So vaccination, remember, is a route to protection. It doesn't resolve and absolve us of all the other issues that are needed, the mental health issues, the physical health issues as well. And I do think sometimes the mental health issues of being isolated in a small group is something we also overlook. But I don't want to broaden the discussion. It's all about fairness, justice, and equality.
Thank you. Indeed, in the next day and a half, we have lots of other panels dealing with those wider issues. Simon, from your perspective, why vaccination for a fair future for seafarers?
You know, I'm completely agree with what has already been mentioned. I just want to, you know, try to perspectivize this from the individual seafarer. We talked about safety way before COVID introduced itself. Safety is also personal safety for your own destiny and for making sure that you as a seafarer will return safe to your family when your contract is done. So I would, of course, urge that would be the perspective that our seafarers also would be taking on a global community. That it will help yourself, but of course you will also help the community. But taking the personal safety perspective, I think also is very important here.
Finally, Francesco, why vaccinations for a fair future for seafarers?
I'd like to offer a slightly different perspective here, because everything my colleagues have just said is 100% right. Perhaps what we haven't actually explored, and it's an unwanted consequences of the crewing crisis and really on everything that's happening with the vaccine, and that is less seafarers than ever before are actually keen to return to sea. And I think that's something that we need to keep very, very, very clear in our minds there. Prioritizing them for vaccine will reassure some of those who are having second thoughts about seafaring as a career. Because let's face it, the industry has historically faced a shortage of qualified staff, and adding another reason why not to go back to sea is probably the last thing we want to do. And unfortunately, talking to our members, we see this is already happening. There's already a lot of widespread reports of people not wanting to come back because A, the first time they were stuck on board for years, B, they couldn't be prioritized when it comes to vaccinations and so forth. So if we were able to convince the world that seafarers need to be treated as priority, we would give them a little bit more status and a bit more, I'm not going to say that they'd be treated along the lines of healthcare workers, but that's the sort of stuff that would be a tick in the box if I wanted to choose seafaring as a profession. I'm an ex-seafarer myself, so I completely understand the way that mentality works.
Well, thank you all for your comments in this last number of minutes. I note that we have a few questions that we didn't get to. I'm sorry about that, about questions about what happens if seafarers don't wish to take the vaccine. And we did have, we can probably continue for a number of minutes on that. But I thank you very much, Francesco and Simon, Ashish, Sohail, for your comments, and wish you all the very best today. And I'd like to hand it on to the next panel for continuing conversation about how to respond to this pandemic. Thank you so very much.